G'day guys, welcome to the spherical form demo. So in this case we're going to be looking at sphere, and it's going to be a little bit different and a little bit more theory based than our previous demos. So I've got a circle right here, and what I'm going to try and represent with this circle is a side view or a side elevation of a sphere. So like everything else, the first thing that I want to establish is my 1, 2, and 3. And to get that, I need to work out my light direction. Now, when we're dealing with a spherical form like this, and we want to establish our 1, 2, 3, it's actually going to change a little. It gets a little bit more technical. So, just like when we're dealing with our other forms, we want to establish our light direction. Just to make life a little easier, we're going to say our light direction is coming like this. And the pitch of our light, that is the angle that our light's going to be coming down on, is, let's say for argument's sake, something like this. Right. So here we have the direction, and here we have the angle that's coming down. Again, we're looking at this from a side view. So as the light comes down and it hits our object, it obviously creates our number 1 face. And what it's going to create is, along this perpendicular axis, that is at 90 degrees to our light source, it creates our number 1 surface. Behind it, grab this, behind this, it's going to form our number 2. Now, after the number 2, we get what's known as our tangent shadow. And in a spherical form, this is also known as a terminator. What happens here is, as the light travels down, grab this, and it runs tangent to our object, there's nowhere for the light to catch, to be able to bounce back into our eye so that we can see it. And so it creates a darkest area because there's no light getting there. The only light that it's receiving possibly is from ambient bounce light. That is the light that's hitting sort of molecules around and getting refracted back, or reflections from other objects that might be within vicinity. But otherwise, it's receiving no direct light, right? And there's no real light source around it. Immediately following that, we have our number 3 face. And this gets broken down into our highlights. Sometimes people refer to this as a highlight, right? Not to be confused with the highlights that you might have running on sort of an edge to pick something up. We also have our number 2 value, which can be at times referred to as our core value. That is the main color or the main value that this object is. And then our number 3 is often referred to as our shadow value or shadow tone. So again, not to be confused with the actual shadow that's being cast, but what it's meaning is that this is the value that's within the shadow that is not being hit by direct light. Because while our tangent shadow doesn't receive any direct light, just like our number 3 value, it doesn't have this ground plane at the back to bounce sufficient enough light to illuminate it. So you get this nice dark band coming down here. What's going to happen though is, because our spherical form, our sphere, is curved, we're going to get an area down here, somewhere along here, that's going to be effectively our occlusion shadow. Right? And that's effectively the shadow that happens when an object gets really close and makes contact with another object. And of course, since we have these lines coming down, we obviously know that our object is going to have a shadow, a cast shadow back here. So hopefully this starts to make a little bit more sense. Spheres are a little tricky to get the hang of, to understand the theory behind them, but they're actually pretty easy to paint. And we're going to be painting most of this using a hard round brush with a little touch up of a soft brush just to blend things through. But one key element to take away from painting spheres is that your tangent shadow, that is your terminator, has to exist where light coming down is running tangent to your object. So with that in mind, if my light is the sun, and that means that my light source is coming down pretty much parallel to each other, then it's going to happen at the widest point perpendicular to the direction of my light. Now we can change this tangent shadow. We can move this tangent shadow forward and we can move this back only in the event, and I'll switch to a different color over here, only in the event, let's say we have a light source and the light is radiating out. It's no longer running parallel. Right, so if I had a light source like a lamp right next to a spherical form, then potentially I could establish a tangent shadow there, because depending on how the light is set up, it might run tangent like so, right? But otherwise, in most normal circumstances, when you're dealing with a larger and a far enough distanced global light, it's going to be running tangent at the widest points. So there is potential to move the light or move this tangent shadow back and forth depending on how you position your light. So when you look at reference images, pay careful attention to that. A lot of references will purposely move the light closer and further away to give you more practice, to give you a better understanding of how light works. So this is the theory behind it. So let's jump in and actually start to paint it. So I have my pre-made mask over here, and really it's just using the marquee tool and creating a circle. I'm just going to select it by holding down Control over here, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of bucket fill this right now with, I'm just going to bucket fill with this sort of 90% black. So what do we want to do? Just like everything else, we want to establish a checklist of what we want to establish. So the first thing that we want to do is establish our 1, 2, and 3. Right? Our 1, 2, and 3 in turn is going to be informed by our light direction. Once we've established that, we also then want to establish our tangent shadow. From our tangent shadow, we want to start to blend. Once we've got enough blending, I then want to add in my shadows, cast or otherwise. So that's my very rough checklist of what I want to do and the order to which I want to do them in. So here I have my sphere again. Obviously I want to select the values that I'm going to choose to work with as well. So in this case, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different than my usual sort of setup. So we're going to go 20% as our number 1 value. And again, we go all the way to black and we find our halfway point. And that's going to be 60%. Right? So here's my number 3 value. My number 2 value is going to be 40%. So my tangent value is always, our tangent shadow value is always going to be darker than number 3. So in this case, I'm just going to say, let's call it 75, right? So that's my tangent value, or my number 4 value. Now for this particular example, I want my light source to be coming, let's say, in this direction, and let's say at this particular angle or something thereabouts. And so what that means is, as my light travels down, is going to hit my spherical form like this. It's going to, if we're thinking about things running tangent, then you can imagine that this line, our tangent shadow, is probably going to look something like this. Right, we don't need this to be perfect right now with this diagram, but we want to mark out where or what we're going to be dealing with. So tangent shadow is going to be about there. Actually, no, it won't be there. It's not quite right. If we want, again, let's go back to what we talked about a little bit earlier. It has to run perpendicular to my light. So if it's running perpendicular to my light, and my light is going to hit this part first, right, and radiating out from here, I want to follow that same curvature. There's a little bit more to think about when we're dealing with spherical forms, so you have to be patient. So that means my tangent shadow is probably going to be somewhere there. So if that's my tangent shadow, stepping in is going to be my number 2 value, and it's going to have a similar profile. You almost want to think of these as a series of ellipses, right? Because essentially that's what it is. We're slicing through a ball here to get what we want. Obviously back here we're going to have, so let's say our number 1, our number 2, our tangent shadow, and our number 3 at the back over here. Now we also need to deal with the fact that our object is going to be sitting on some form of ground plane. And that means bounce light, right? Just like when we're dealing with vertical surface, light comes down, hits the ground, bounces up, and it creates a gradient. So we're going to have the same thing. So light's going to come down, it's going to hit the front of this object or the ground of this object, and it's going to bounce up to illuminate the bottom over here, right, to lighten this part. Now back here we don't have a lot, but we're still going to have something that's a little bit darker, but around it surrounded by something that's a bit lighter just from the bounce light coming in. Right, but quite dark back here because there's not as much light. And then we can also plot in the center of our spherical form is about there. My light direction is forming in that direction. Then my shadow, my cast shadow, is going to be pulled back in this direction. So that's going to then give me a cast shadow, something approximating this. Now we have to think about, let's get rid of this. So we're going to get a cast shadow that's going to approximate something like so. Now we can flip this around because right now our light direction, so this is, this is the light behind us, behind our POV. So what if the light was in front of our POV, that is the light shining towards us? How would we go about breaking that down? Well, we'd do the reverse really. So if light, again, let's say the light direction is like this, and the angle is like this, it's going to hit somewhere around there. So we're not really going to see it, but we can still establish our tangent shadow. It's going to disappear somewhere behind there. So that means that what we see though is our number 2 value, but we're not really going to see our number 1 because it's on the other side of the object. We're going to see a lot more of our number 3. We're still definitely going to be able to see our tangent shadow. But what we will see is we're going to start to see a little bit more of a darker occlusion shadow as it moves away from reflective surfaces. And we follow the direction of the light. We'll be able to, if the base of our object's about there, we'll be able to see more of that cast shadow. All right, so let's go back. We're going to do the light source from behind us. And let's go ahead and start painting this in. So I've selected my overall object. I have my images, well, the values that I'm going to be using. So let's go ahead and pick our darkest value and let's go ahead and bucket fill that in. I'm going to hide my marching ants by hitting Control H. And let's go ahead and select a large round circle brush, something about like this. Right. Just going to drop my opacity down, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my brightest value first, and I'm going to start painting on top. But the way that I want to do this is I don't want to draw it like just a circle like so. I want to try and mimic an ellipse, that is putting it back into perspective. So you notice that when I'm applying my brush strokes, I'm applying it in an elliptical way. Now it's a little messy right now, but it's all right. We can always go clean it up. And we've got our number 3 value back here. So I'm just going to start to apply that. Oh, that was our number 3. My apologies. So we're going to hit our number 2. So we're going to get that transition from our 1 into our number 2 value. If I find I'm starting to lose my edges, for example, let's say I start to do this, and it starts to look a little bit weird, I can always select the values I want again and just go back and reinforce it. If I find I'm starting to lose my edge as well, because we also think that light bends, so we're going to see a little bit of our other values come through on the other side. I can also take that color and kind of push it back. I'm just going to turn off my notes because they're a little distracting. And then I can select my tangent shadow. In this case, I'm just going to go with 80 just so it's a little bit darker, easier for me to see. I'm going to see how to place it around. Now, as the light comes down, we're going to have a little bit of a shadow from the back in terms of an occlusion shadow. We're really going to have a little bit of bounce light from the back as well, and then from the front of where it's going to sit on. But you can see how, as a very rough idea, just breaking it down like this, you can see on the smaller navigator here, it's already starting to have a little bit, quite a bit of a, not just a little bit, but quite a bit of a spherical form holding up. And our next part, and this part that's really quite easy, is we just have to select our values. And in this case, actually I'm going to keep it like this, relatively soft. Drop my brush size a little bit, and I'm just going to start to blend it in. And again, you'll notice that when I'm painting, I'm not painting in straight lines. I'm painting in elliptical sort of motions to try and maintain that form, because your brush strokes, or your pen strokes, or pencil shading, and or marker strokes, they're going to help influence the direction. Right? They're going to help influence the read of the form as well. So when we're dealing with our planar objects, we want flatter, straighter, more linear sort of brush strokes. When we're dealing with a curved surface like this, in this particular case, a spherical object, we want to then maintain that spherical form. So we go in and we apply our brush strokes are a little bit more elliptical. Because again, an ellipse is just a circle in perspective. And what is our sphere but just a series of ellipses stacked on top of each other. Let's blend this in. And I can see from my navigator here, it's a little bit too severe in terms of my tangent shadow. So I just want to soften it. Again, that tangent shadow really only happens at a very, very small part. Right, so it's not a big, great black line. It's a very small, sort of very fine blend that you get. If you want to, find like a really huge example of this in real life, you can have a look at photos of planets. Right? Now, the only difference is when you're looking at something in space, you don't have a lot of bounce light. So, oftentimes, let's say you find a photo of the Earth, you'll see that it's got this beautiful sort of blue pearl, and then it just goes into black. That's because there's no bounce light in space. But if you were to put that, if you get like a tennis ball, or whatever ball you have at home, and you put it on the table or your desk or the floor, and you shine a light on it, you'll see there's this sort of gradual fade. Now, obviously the object has a bit of color, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can always take a picture with your phone and then just turn it to a black and white image, and you'll see it a lot clearer. And again, this is where reference packs become, or reference images become really, really useful, because they'll give you lighting conditions and setups that you don't really have access to when you're dealing with your own sort of, if you were to put a tennis ball on your table or on your desk at home, you just don't have access to certain conditions. It's a good way to start practicing, but if you want to push your skills, you can do a little, the reference packs are really good to kind of take it to that next level. You see I'm slowly blending away, and all I'm doing right now is I'm just using a hard round brush. I haven't even used a soft brush yet. And the way that I like to think about this is I'm sculpting the surface. I'm sculpting the values to get the form that I want. And you see all these little, nudges, these little sort of brush strokes, and it has this sort of plasticine or clay-like feel to it. And I'm using that to my advantage to try and sell the shape. I'm starting to lose a little bit of my tangent shadow here. So I'm just going to go back and I'm just going to reinforce it a little bit more by applying that original value that we had, because originally our tangent value was only going to be about 70%. It just has to be darker than your number 3 value. So our number 3 value was 70, so it was 60, so 70 is fine, even 65 is fine. It just has to be darker. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be like 100% black or something. It just has to be darker than our number 3 value. I'm just blending it in. Of course, we know that our light is coming a little bit high. Right now my tangent shadow has my light coming in a little bit too low, and remember my original notes, it's actually quite high, so I have to actually rotate this whole thing up. So it's a very common thing that as you paint, you kind of, things will shift. So you just have to be aware of that and kind of shift it back. So let's pull our number 1 value back up. Push the bottom of this up a little bit more. And this gets us closer to our original lighting direction. The way that I like to think about form painting or value painting is really it's just a push and pull of values, right? Now I do want something a little bit lighter in there, so I'm purposely going to just pick a brighter value, maybe even a white, just so that I can reinforce this point where it's going to be brightest of the object, where the light is going to hit first, and then slowly blend out. Just reinforcing my tangency back here again. The tangency is pretty important because it helps defines the form quite a bit. It's almost, because we're dealing with a round object, we don't really have access to to an edge, right, that you get with a planar surface. So we have to try and use what tools we have on hand. The best one that we have on hand is our tangent value. So it bleeds into a bit of a crescent shape. Now we have to imagine that this is sitting on an object as well. So a little bit of bounce light is going to come through, a little bit of a wider value is going to come through at the bottom. And that's going to blend in a little bit. So we're going to still have a little bit of our tangency coming through the other side. Push this value down a little bit. And we know that there's less back here, so in this case I'm going to purposely put in something a little bit darker. Just to exaggerate the form a little bit more. So a lot of these sort of tricks or these formulas, these processes of, okay, you pick this color and as a result, this value results in, you know, this is your darkest value, this is your brightest value. A lot of these are just guides. They're just there as to help you get started. You'll then have to make that decision as you start painting of what you want to emphasize and how best you're going to emphasize. Because when we're painting, we're not just representing what's there. When we're painting, we are also trying to guide the viewer's eye, telling them what we want them to look at, what is important. So it's almost almost like a hyper-realistic version of what's actually there. Because if we just wanted something that was super realistic, we can either just take a photograph, or we can build a 3D model and then light it perfectly. Right, so why is there a need to paint it? Well, because with painting, we can add in a little bit of creative licensing. We can help establish what we want the viewer to look at first, second, and third. Right, what's important. All right, so now light's coming down here. So there's a little bit more of my number 2 that should be back here. All right, so now this is kind of mostly done in terms of our brush, you know, our rough broad strokes are there. What we can do is we can take a soft brush, so like this, and we can, we can start to, keep pressing the wrong key. We can start to soften our object a little bit more. Again, I'm just picking the values nearby and just ever so slightly softening things. Just to make this blend a little better. Again, you'll see in terms of the way that I'm moving my brush, it's very circular, it's very elliptical, because we want to mimic the surface of our object as best as we can. Let's just brighten this up a little bit more. Right. A little bit of a bloom, so the object feels a little smoother than it really is. Right, so now our light source is following through. We can see our tangency a little bit getting lost with that bounce light. But again, if we choose that we don't really want that bounce light in there as much, we can always go in and take my hard brown brush again. We can always go in and we can actually start to paint it out. So if there's anything that we don't like, there's nothing stopping us from going in and changing it. Again, this is why why painting can be quite versatile, why we don't just take photos of things or 3D render things all the time, is that when we're painting, we actually have quite a bit of control over what we want to show. We can also start to push certain things, like create a bit of texture as if this was made out of clay or the surface is a little bit rough. So here's the object from the front. So we're going to do one where the object is from the back. We're going to use the same value setup. So I'm going to take my number 3 value, which was 60, and go ahead and bucket fill that. And this time it's really just the opposite. If we look back to our notes, or over here, we just want to follow this. So here's my tangency. So I'm just going to select 80. Now, the reason why I'm selecting something darker is my brush opacity and flow are set quite low. So if I were to select the actual value that I want, it might take a little while for me to get that coverage. Of course, I can just go ahead and change my brush settings, but sometimes you're a little bit lazy. Well, at least I'm a little bit lazy. So let's pick our medium value and number 2 value. That's going to be wrapped around here. Obviously, our number 3 value is all the way back here. A little bit of number 2. It's going to come in sneaking through the edges, just again because we're dealing with a curved surface. And then all we do at this point is we just start to blend it together. And I was trying to work with a relatively large brush. Not too ridiculous, but the reason why I want to work with a large brush is it's going to force me to follow the big contours, the big forms, and I won't get as lost in the little details. Let's turn this off so it's not as distracting. Now, we spoke a little earlier about how there's a occlusion shadow over here, just because it's going to be a darkest area where it makes contact. Okay, so that gives us enough of material to work with. And moving in this sort of elliptical fashion. So regardless of whether you're painting a sphere from the front or the back, this mechanical process of blending, of trying to follow the contours of the form, doesn't really change. It stays pretty much the same. I'm going to brighten this a little bit just to show a little bit of the number one value coming through. A bit sneaking at the bottom. And the way that I'm using my brush, you'll notice that I'm hovering, really, the center of my brush is hovering off the my canvas or off my painted area, because I just want a little, it's kind of like just using the edge of a real paintbrush or edge of your pen. I don't want to apply it right in the middle, because it's really, I just want it to suggest that value, or that value is on the other side, and you're really just seeing a little bit of it kind of peeking through. So this way our light is coming towards us, right, at quite an angle, but we could flip this around so the angle is a little bit more, so we show off a little bit more of our tangent shadow, and a little bit more of an number one surface as well. I think it will make for a better example. So again, we're just gonna, just like before, how I kind of, I didn't have the values in the right place, and I kind of had to nudge everything over. We're doing the same thing now, but this time we're just pushing that core shadow, that core value down a little bit more. Brighter value, just to start to scent at a little bit of a number one value. Again, trying to follow that crescent shape. I want a little bit of that light number two value kind of creeping through the other side, because we know that light, I think oftentimes I'll explain light like water. So it's going to hit a surface, it's going to want to bead around. It's going to want to flow along the contours. So I'm starting to build up my form, sculpting it out. And we can switch to our soft brush here, and we're just going to smooth things out. starting to lose my darker value back here, but before I do that, I just want to introduce a little bit of a lighter value here just to show that the light is kind of creeping around. And then to enhance that, I'm just going to pick a darker value. And just again, in this elliptical fashion. Go back to my hard round brush, just to help sculpt that a little bit more. You gotta be careful, I deselected my image before. But yeah, the really cool thing is once you've deselected, since I have my mask already, I can go in and still paint whatever I want. And I don't have to be too bothered, because I can always reselect the mask, invert my selection, which is Control-Shift-I, hit delete, and that's gonna kill everything outside of this boundary. So again, part of the reason why I love working digitally is that you have so much control over what you're doing that you just don't have when you're working traditionally. So I've got my two values over here in terms of my two objects, right, front and back. So if I'm looking at this now, there's a bit of highlight over here. I think I want to introduce a little bit of a flare or a bloom, a light bloom of a brighter sort of #1 value just over here. If you look at any sort of planet Earth documentary series, it's going to have, you'll see the Earth, and then they'll have this nice beautiful bloom of the sun hitting the atmosphere, hitting the surface of the globe, and it's going to bleed a little bit across. And that's exactly what we're trying to replicate here. And I'm trying to line up this bloom along with my core over here. It's almost like skewering it straight down the middle. Use my hard round brushes to push the values back a little bit. Of course, we also, part of using the hard round brush is we are painting something, so let's make it look like a painting. Let's not hide the fact that it's a painting. So brush strokes, I think, are a really wonderful thing because they can help create more contours, more teeth, more texture to your painting. All right, so I'm going to take these two, I'm going to shrink them down. And let's space them apart. All right, so we have our two spherical objects, but right now neither one of these has, it's particularly grounded anything because it's just on a white background. Again, with these tutorials are designed that at each step we're kind of pushing our ability. So let's go in and let's create our cast shadow. So I'm going to rotate my canvas, select this dark value. My shadow, my light source is coming back here, so my occlusion shadow is going to be there, right? Just like we have an occlusion shadow when we did our planar objects, we're going to have an occlusion shadow that's going to sit somewhere there. And so what you're seeing here is just a little bit of that bloom. Select slightly another value that's not as dark. I'm going to pull back to my establish my #2 value, which is going to be my cast shadow. And we can apply the same idea over here. The edge of my occlusion shadow. Let's go ahead and start to build up. So I can almost select the values around here. So since this area here, my core shadow, is this pronounced, that is, we see so much of it, it tells me that my shadow is going to be pretty long. So I'm going to purposely phase it out a little so I don't end up having to have this ridiculous tail. Alright, so let's blend this out a little bit more. I'm a firm believer in that. Always try and use the biggest brush that you can. It's going to save you from getting too caught up in the details. Because what's important at the end of the day is actually, weirdly enough, it's not this that makes it work. If it works over here, it's going to work over here. If it doesn't work as a big picture, that is when you step back from it, it's definitely not going to work as a smaller one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in a little bit of a background. Now since this is light coming in here, I want something a little bit darker behind my object so that we can pop this a little bit more. Let's beef this up so it's a little bit faster. Right, so we get a nice sense of contrast. Take some of these values and just kind of blend them in. And we have the reverse over here, where it's the flip side of it. So we're just going to darken this a little bit more. Really just kind of slathering down the values. And then I'm just going to, let's bring this up a little bit. Take this value, and start to just kind of blend the two together. Kind of blending in just sort of a light grayish background. I'm going to be painting over this soon, so I'm really just kind of providing my background with a bit of teeth, a bit of value that I can work with. Let's go create a new layer over here, and now I'm going to go in again and use my hard round brush. So no texture brushes really, we're just using the default tool package that Photoshop comes with. Blending it through. My light's coming down here, so my shadow is going to loop a little bit more behind. I want this slightly brighter value at the back, just to denote where it stops, or where it might stop. And again, I'm using this lighter value to help contrast between my object and the background, so we get a nice, clean, easy to read silhouette. When we're dealing with painting, when we're dealing with sort of illustrative stuff, it's actually, at least from my personal opinion, accuracy is not what we're after. We don't want something that's mimicking real life. What we're after is an artistic interpretation. We want to see a heightened version of reality. Right? No one lines up at the theaters, or no one lines up at the opera or the gallery, or even when you flip open a magazine. You don't really want to see real life. You don't want to see people doing their taxes. What you want is you want something a little bit larger than life. You want something that's hyper realistic, almost like a fantasy. Because we all have access to real life. To varying degrees, whether we live comfortable lives or we live a little, our lives are a little bit more difficult. We all know that experience, and so there's no need to kind of escape from that. or to look for that because it's right in front of us and it's free. But when we're after it's a little bit different, then that's when we have to think about, okay, how do we go about creating something that's real in terms of follows the basic rules of physics and light and all these things that we have in real life, but still give something that we would otherwise not have access to. So even with the shadows, I'm following a crescent shape because I want to mimic the contours of my object. Actually want something darker in here just to help that pop. And then now that we've kind of got most of this established, I can go in with my soft brush and I can start to blend it a little bit better. And try and use a pretty large brush. Let's up my opacity and my flow. I'm just going to bleed that out. I'm going to blend that in a little bit more. A little bit of that almost dark just to create a little bit more of an occlusion shadow. Pull some of that shadow back a little bit. It's a bit too strong, so we can just grab the values around it and soften it up. So why do we want to avoid small brushes? Because let's say, for example, when I start to blend my values like this, you can start to see these very scratchy brush strokes, and they're a little bit ugly. So we do want to work with a larger brush, and that's going to help us minimize those things. We do want contours, but we don't want that sort of scratchiness. So it's very important to try and find that balance. All right, let's go ahead and clean this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group all this, duplicate it. So we still have our original. We never feel that we've lost anything. Let's go ahead and create a nice sort of border for this. I'm going to select all this, and well, actually I don't really need to, but what I want to do is I want to kind of homogenize this top part a little bit more, so it looks a little bit strange with that value. Be careful, I don't want to accidentally give it a bit of, I don't want to give it too much of a halo. And the other thing you can do is once you finish, you can take some of these values around it and you can apply sort of a light sort of dusting of some of the values around in terms of our background onto our object, just as a way to kind of as a hint to bounce line, that so it looks a little bit more anchored into its location. Let's clean this up again. All right, so here we have our sphere with the light coming behind us, hitting the object face on, and this is the light behind hitting the object, and it's coming towards us. If I could fix this up a little bit, I think I would kind of knock this a little bit back and blend this a little bit more. All right, so here you go. So here we have our two spheres all painted up. Now again, the basic idea when we're dealing with our spherical objects is that we want to understand where our elements are. So we can see following down here our tangent shadow. We can see our number 1 face. We can see our number 2. In this case, back here is our number 3. So the reverse, we have our number 3 over here. Number 2, little bit of our number 1 poking through. And then we have our occlusion shadow down here. Right, our core shadow coming back over here. Of course, we have a little bit of our car shadow as well coming through. And of course, we have to remember that our tangent shadow, if we were to cut this, the light's going to come down, and our tangent shadow has to sit at 9 degrees, right? And from here, we can create our ellipse to create the path for our tangent shadow.